Hi, my name is Sadie Ingram, and I'm the public history graduate student that created the newest exhibit here at the Georgia Southern Museum. It's called Harvesting History, the Georgia Oyster Industry. So the oyster industry in the United States started up in New York and the Chesapeake Bay area region, and then over-harvesting pushed it down further south as they kept looking for areas with more and more oysters. And Georgia's oysters were particularly suited for being canned just because of the shape of them. So oysters grown subtidally are the nice round ones. They're nice and smooth, and it's the ones you can see here. Those are the ones that you usually find in restaurants where you eat them on a half shell. Georgia's oysters, they grow intertidally in that marsh mud, and they're all clumped together because it helps them survive. It helps them not get suffocated by the mud. And as you can see all along the bottom of the case here, and in this picture, they're ugly looking, and that's the term that they use to refer to them as ugly oysters. They're all clustered together. They're really skinny, scrawny looking things. They're really sharp and jagged, and it's just not something you can serve to someone on a half shell. So they make really good for canning. So who was harvesting these oysters for the canneries? The workforce for these canneries was predominantly the Gullah Geechee community in Georgia. Gullah Geechee referring to the descendants of the West African enslaved people that were brought over. So they pretty much had very innate knowledge of the waterways and the natural environment. This was oyster harvesting, fishing, crabbing, all this kind of stuff would have been something they would have done while enslaved. And then that knowledge just carried on down generations and traditions. So to harvest oysters, men would go out in bateaus, and right here is a half model of a real one that sits out in front of Rousseau's Seafood in Savannah currently. A bateau is just, it's French for boat. It's basically just a flat bottom boat, something we would think of today as like a John boat. The one that sits out in front of Rousseau's Seafood is believed to be one of the last remaining bateaus of the ones made at Pinpoint Community. This one, for example, was named the Miss Helen after Miss Helen Johnson, a Gullah Geechee individual from Pinpoint who sold it to Charles Rousseau for his business. So men would go out in these bateaus. Oftentimes down here in Georgia and in South Carolina, they would harvest them by hand at low tide. You could take a rake, kind of break them up, and then just scoop them up in your hands. And you'd fill your bateau up with as many oysters as you could, and then you would come back into shore. So once the oystermen had their bateaus filled with oysters, they would take them to the cannery to be shucked. And the shucking was often done by women, children after school, and elderly men who used to be oystermen but were too old to be out in the water harvesting oysters anymore. So some canneries would steam the oysters prior to shucking, and that would make them easier to open. And you can see that in the picture down here are the big carts that the oysters were steamed in. Everybody's standing around it, shucking the oysters. You can see on the side of one of the carts is a big metal tin can, and that was called an oyster gallon cup. It wasn't necessarily a true gallon. The measurements kind of varied from cannery to cannery, but basically that, you fill that up, and then that is what you're paid by. How many oyster gallon cups can you produce in a day? And that's your daily wage. So once the oysters were shucked, they'd go over to be canned. Canning used to be done by hand in the early 1800s, but by the end, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was machinery that would do it for you. So in most canneries in Georgia, African American women would do the perceived dirtier task of shucking the oysters, while white women would can the oysters. It was seen as a cleaner task. But as the demand for oysters increased, the demand for labor increased, and African American women were promoted to canners as well.